So I wanted to welcome you to the 8th Annual CALDER Conference, and I'm going to begin with just a couple of remarks and actually get us rolling into sessions a little bit early. The visually astute among you may know that I am not Jane Hanaway. Jane got a faculty position this year at Georgetown University and will continue to be associated with CALDER, but I was lucky enough to inherit her position as the director of CALDER, and frankly, there are some big shoes to fill. She sadly could not be here. She has a family emergency, which is sad because she has a family emergency, but also sad because this was going to be an opportunity to say thank you to Jane. Jane, I won't bore you with my history, but I'll just say very quickly that I worked for Jane years ago at the Urban Institute. So she, for me, had a kind of a tremendous impact on my career. She was terrific to work for, and I think that she's been terrific for all of us who are part of CALDER and bringing us together and sort of keeping us on the same track. And hopefully you all are here in this room because you see CALDER as an important institution. So while Jane can't be here, I'm going to just clap for her. And maybe next year when she's here, we can do that again. Okay, so we have, I think, a terrific conference set up for today. It's largely going to look like it did in past years with I think, one tweak in that it will be a little bit less, look a little bit less like an academic conference in that we do not have academic discussants for any of the papers. We figure we kind of get the academic perspective on the papers at the academic conferences. Instead, we have asked folks to serve as reactors and struggled a little bit about what to call the reactors because they have various positions. So some of the reactors are in school systems or involved with states or at foundations, but they're all people that in some way or another have a role in connecting research and data to policy. And so the idea is to try and get a sense of how people who serve that role see the research and what their sense is about what the research says, what it doesn't say, how convincing it is. And so the way that the conference is going to work is that we will have, actually let me get my schedule here. In panel one, I won't go through all of the details, but panel one is about teacher recruitment, selection, and retention, and there are 4 papers. Each of the presenters will have 18 minutes to present, and I don't see Alvaro. Alvaro in the back is going to hold up signs that say you have 5 minutes left, you have 1 minute left, and stop, and we really need the presenters to take the stop seriously because it's kind of a packed, and the whole day is packed. And then the reactors will react to the presentations either. Steve, how did you want to run it? Did you want to run the reactors after all 4 of the presentations? Okay. Well, I'll let Steve dictate how things are going to go on the first section. Second section is about accountability pressure and the possibility of unintended consequences. And Thomas Way? Thomas. Nice. It's nice to meet you. Did I pronounce your last name correctly? Okay. Thomas and Jared. I know I saw Jared this morning. Jared are going to serve as the reactors, and one of you is taking the lead as the chair of that session. And then we'll have a lunch break. In the afternoon is a post-secondary section, tracking students into college and the labor market. And Ed Bowen, is Ed here? Hopefully Ed will be here by this afternoon. And James Benson. And hopefully James will be here. James and Ed are reactors for the last session, or for the afternoon session. Last session is on immigrant siblings and TFAers. And if you don't see a theme to that session, you're just not looking hard enough. We couldn't, in terms of the papers that were really hot off the presses, we couldn't think of a kind of a coherent theme, but this is all interesting work. So we put those papers together in a last session. So there'll be reactors, there'll be some time for questions from the floor. I should say that if you have questions, please wait on getting a microphone before asking your question, and please make sure that the question is actually a question and not a long statement. I want to thank Jeff, raise your hand, Jeff, and Alvaro, and Vicki Brady, who couldn't be here today but did quite a lot of work. They all did quite a lot of work in getting the CALDER session set up. And if you all have questions during the course of the day, Jeff and Alvaro, who are back there, are the right people to ask. There are bathrooms here, but honestly, I couldn't even direct you to the bathrooms. I'm out in Seattle most of the time. So Jeff, tell me where to tell people the bathrooms are. He's pointing in this direction for those who aren't looking back. Okay. Okay, and Jeff, what am I forgetting to mention? All right, I'm getting the thumbs up. So we're a little bit early because the original plan had been for Jane to sort of give a quick retrospective about CALDER. I'm sad that Jane isn't able to do that, but I'm glad that we get to start early because it was going to be tight. So what I would ask is for the first panelist, all the panelists and reactors to come up to the front, and I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and I think that we are actually going to just get started. So thank you again for coming, and I'm looking forward to a good day. Steve Cantrell from the Gates Foundation. Kick us off, Steve.
So this is a great panel. I read the papers, so I've got some advanced knowledge here. This will be terrific. Why is everybody sitting in the back? You guys got a date? So let's encourage, as people come in, just point toward the front so that people can fill in here. It feels like church. So on the panel, I'm not going to introduce everybody simply because everybody's listed in the panel, their paper names are listed in the panel, and we are going to get rolling quickly. But Tennille, I have not met yet, and Tennille is the other reactor. Do you want to say a quick word about where you come from?
Sure. So my name is Tennille. And I am from Spokane, Washington, which is on the other side of the state from Seattle, and it's not nearly as cold as where I am currently. My first time to D.C., so I'm freezing. I am the Chief Human Resources Officer for Spokane Public Schools, and that's the second largest school district in the state of Washington. Though people don't necessarily see us that way, we're very much a large urban school system for Washington State, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan. So we're going to go in the order of the program. As Dan said, the presenters have 18 minutes. Then what we're going to do is, this is the way it was scheduled, and I mixed things up a little bit, so allow me that privilege if you would. It was scheduled 18 minutes, and then for each presenter, then 15 minutes for the discussants and then it left you 18 minutes total. And you know what happens to your 18 minutes. Usually they shrink to about 3 minutes. And so I said, no, let's keep to the 18 minutes, and let's have a comment or two from the reactors, and then let's have a question or two. We'll keep it within about 26 minutes. I've got a couple different alarms to keep me on pace here. And then we'll have a few minutes at the end for a couple more reactions across the paper set, and we'll open it up for a few more questions. And so I think that'll keep the mix right, we'll see. It might not work, and you might say that was a really bad idea, Steve. But anyway, let's kick it off with Tim. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Make sure we have some slides.
We should.
Ah, okay. Okay. Here we go. And working clicker? Yes, we do. Okay. There's a joint work with Feng at Texas State. As you can see there, we're looking at a program in Florida designed to deal with shortages of teachers in so-called critical need areas. Many districts throughout the country face difficulty in staffing positions in areas that either have high training requirements or where potential applicants have high alternative wages. So particularly math and science at the high school level and special education as well. And these problems are made worse in schools that are often deemed less desirable. So there's lots of research indicating that that teachers tend to flee schools with high levels of poverty, low achievement, greater discipline problems. At the heart of all this is the fixed salary schedule that is in place in most districts where all teachers are given experience level and credentials receive the same pay irrespective of the field they're teaching in or the school they're teaching in. You don't need to read the details of this chart. The solid red line at the bottom is for elementary education. All the other lines represent so-called high need or critical shortage areas like English as a second language, foreign languages, math, reading, science, and special ed. And this chart indicates the percentage of new hires who are not certified in their subject area. And you can see obviously very low for elementary ed, much higher for all these other disciplines. So just one indicator of the difficulty of staffing these critical need areas. There's lots of possible policy solutions to this problem of staffing critical need areas. In some states have used one-time hiring bonuses to try and attract personnel. My current home state of Georgia has a differential pay system for math and science teachers, starting them up at an enhanced step when they begin teaching. Many districts have differential pay programs, and for a time North Carolina had a bonus program for math, science, and special ed teachers in high poverty schools. Much more common, though, is actually to subsidize the education of teachers. So many states have programs like the one we'll be looking at today that either offer loan forgiveness or some sort of subsidy to teachers' education. There's also loan forgiveness used at the federal level as well. Despite the wide use of loan forgiveness to try and attract teachers, there's virtually no research on the impact of these programs. Really, the only really high-quality research is the work that Charlie Clodfelter and Sunny Ladd and colleagues did back in 2008 looking at North Carolina's bonus program. And then they found that despite a relatively modest bonus of $1,800, they found substantially large impacts on reducing turnover in these high-need areas. So Florida's program had two components. One is a loan forgiveness program In order to qualify, a teacher had to be teaching and certified in one of the designated subject areas. If they met those requirements, they were eligible to receive up to $10,000 in loan forgiveness. $2,500 per year if it was an undergraduate loan, $5,000 per year if it was a graduate loan, 2-year maximum for the graduate loans, 4 years for the undergraduate loans. And renewal of the loan forgiveness was contingent upon continuing to teach and be certified in a designated shortage area. So the primary impact of this program we think would be on teacher retention, because you had to actually be teaching and certified in the area before you could qualify. The other component was tuition reimbursement, and this was for existing teachers who were taking coursework that could lead to certification in one of these critical need areas. So it could be teachers that were teaching an area but were not fully certified yet, or in some cases could be teachers in a related discipline, say a biology teacher wanting to get certified in chemistry. The payments were more modest for this component of the program. So as you can see that they could receive up to $78 per credit hour and a maximum of 9 credit hours per year with a total possible reimbursement of about $2,800. So here, rather than trying to retain teachers, we think the primary impact of the tuition reimbursement is really to try and direct teachers from one subject area to another, and for those teaching the area to become certified. The program was established back in 1984. Payments began a couple years later, and the program continued until the spring of 2011 when it was terminated. So the last cohort to receive reimbursement was 2009-10. We explored a couple of variations in the program to try and identify the impacts of the program. One is that the designated shortage areas changed over time. So some areas were on the list in one year and not another. And also the amount of the reimbursements or loan forgiveness changed year to year based on legislative appropriations. Here's a chart indicating the number of teachers receiving tuition reimbursement over time, and the number of the green dash line is those receiving tuition reimbursement, the purple loan forgiveness. And this chart shows changes in funding over time. So it was a drastic drop in funding around 2000, about a 50% cut in the generosity of these programs. The data we use comes from two sources. Florida's Education Data Warehouse is a unified K-20 database in Florida. So we can look at the entire universe of teachers and their students in Florida, starting in 1995, and the most recent year we have is 2012-13. Not only can we link students and teachers to each other and to the classrooms they're in, but also we can compute so-called value-added measures of the impact of teachers on student test scores. And then from the Office of Student Financial Assistance, we're able to get individual level records of these tuition reimbursement and loan forgiveness payments. Though that data is more limited, we only have loan forgiveness payments from 96 forward, and then the reimbursement payments, we only have reliable data from 2001 forward. Once again, you probably can't see this, but all you have to do is kind of look at the patterns here. Oops. The columns represent different subject areas that were designated as critical need areas over time. Since we don't have data prior to 1995, we can kind of ignore the top half of the chart. And we also exclude vocational areas and school psychologists, focus on the academic areas, one being middle and high school science. And you can see there that it was targeted after our data starts, so we can look both before, during, and after it was a critical need area. Likewise for high school math. Also for special education, there we only we observe it while the program is in place, and then for a few years after all the programs were terminated. Foreign language, we can observe changes over time. Also middle and high school English, and reading. And then English as a second language, like special education, we only observe it not being a critical need area after the entire program is terminated. The methods we employ to take a look at the impacts of these programs. For loan forgiveness, we're interested in whether or not the program is leading to increased retention of teachers. So we estimate so-called hazard model, and we employ a difference in difference approach where we're comparing teachers who are eligible for loan forgiveness versus not, and then comparing periods in which a subject area was covered and when it was not. For tuition reimbursement, we're just looking at the likelihood that a teacher becomes certified in one of these designated critical areas. And then on the teacher quality side, we just have some descriptive evidence about the relationship between teacher quality and participants in these programs. So, as I said, for the loan forgiveness, the critical issue is the program able to enhance the retention of teachers in these critical need areas? And this is a survival graph of teachers remaining in public schools in Florida. So you can see that the proportion that remain decreases over time. The blue line is teachers who did not receive loan forgiveness, and the red line is ones that did. I think the interesting thing to see here is that the blue line starts out below the red, indicating that those who received loan forgiveness, the red line, have higher retention for about the first 5 years or so. Not coincidentally, that's the typical length of time that teachers would be receiving loan forgiveness payments. Typically, they would receive their first payment after they've been teaching for a year, so at the end of the second year of teaching, and then they could receive payments for up to 4 years. So it seems like it's working as long as they receive payments, but then the retention rate actually falls below that of other teachers, reflecting the fact in these areas they have higher opportunity cost outside of teaching. If we look at the results of the difference in difference model, you can see that we find significant impacts for some subjects, but not all. The key number here is to look at whether the so-called hazard rate is above or below 1. If it's below 1, it indicates that they're less likely to exit, so that the program's working in a sense. So you can see that for math and science, we're getting statistically significant effects, as well as at least in some specifications for foreign languages and for English as a second language. Next, what we do is to exploit the fact that funding for the program changed dramatically around 2000. So we split up the period into a high payoff period and a low payoff period. And what you see is that in addition to the programs that were significant before, now at least in the high funding area, we see a significant impact on retention for special ed teachers. And for ESOL, both in the high and low periods, there was significant reduction in attrition. The other program was this tuition reimbursement program, where teachers could be reimbursed for expenditures and courses that could lead to certification in one of these critical areas. One of the striking things we found is that a large proportion of the teachers who received these payments were already teaching or certified in at least one shortage area. So you can see that the light blue is certified, the purple is teaching an area, and on the axis is the number of years prior or post receiving their first tuition reimbursement. So you can see that, for example, 2 years before they got their first payment, over 70% were already teaching in a designated area. So it appears that there was some improvement in terms of getting teachers teaching in these areas and certified in these areas, but the effects are pretty modest. And that is borne out in the statistical analysis. What we did, as I said, was predict the likelihood that someone would switch into become certified in one of these critical need areas. And not surprisingly, if they were already teaching an area, more likely they became certified. If they received tuition reimbursement, they were more likely to become certified, but the magnitudes are really small. And these are marginal effects on the probability of becoming certified. Lastly, in terms of teacher quality, we just created some graphical distributions of value added in mathematics based on whether someone received, in this case, loan forgiveness or not, and whether they stayed in the system or exited. And essentially see that the loan forgiveness recipients, whether they stayed or left, tended to have somewhat lower value added than non-participants. In contrast, for tuition reimbursement, we essentially find no difference in teacher quality. So the bottom line is that the loan forgiveness program did seem to be effective in reducing attrition, at least for some subject areas, and that the effects were stronger when, not surprising, when the payouts were higher. The tuition reimbursement program also seemed to have positive effects, but pretty modest in terms of their size, and seemed to be mainly taken up by people who are already teaching in a critical need area. And lastly, as I said, in terms of quality, we have some evidence that the loan forgiveness recipients were of lower quality as measured by value added, but no differences by whether they stayed or left, and no differences for the tuition reimbursement recipients. Thank you.
Terrific. Tennille, can we start with you? Do you have a question or a comment for Tim?
So I am going to try to monitor myself. I don't have a sign to tell me that I only have 5 minutes, but I will try to pay attention to your body language. So some initial thoughts that I have, just as somebody who is responsible for the talent management program at our district, is how can we really take information such as this and think differently about our recruitment efforts. I am painting with a really broad brush as it relates to the state of Washington, but feel like I can just because I spend a lot of time with my colleagues, and none of us yet, and I think we're beginning to, none of us yet are really having research-driven conversations about when to start recruitment efforts. So, for example, pretty passively right now, it's my opinion that it's passive, we're just focusing on student teachers in universities. But if you look at something that may seem like a weird analogy, if you look at athletics and the way that recruitment begins, you're paying attention to people that demonstrate certain aptitudes at a much younger age. And so I'm thinking, what is it that we need to be doing in terms of our organization and efforts to really focus on, as we're getting more information about aptitude among high school students, really critically encouraging people to choose particular professions, math and science, these shortage areas, and then following kids through their higher education and getting them to commit to us earlier and earlier for these professions. So I do think I found it interesting that there were some benefits. It makes sense to me in terms of what I see relative to loan forgiveness. I haven't noticed a correlation between people leaving our district when loan forgiveness stops, but in some ways we're a little bit of an anomaly. Well, we've got pretty high retention. That's not our issue. Retention across the board isn't, we'd like to lose some people, frankly, that we're managing to retain. So retention is something that we are less concerned about than we are recruitment in these shortage areas. So those are some initial thoughts for me.
Terrific. Thanks. So, Tim, I just have a question for you, just a really practical question. Is this a program, in your view, that's working? Would you recommend that districts do a loan forgiveness program, and if so, under what conditions?
Well, it did. I was a little surprised that, indeed, it seemed to work fairly well, since the payments, particularly in the later years, were modest. So I think it is one of many tools that districts might consider using. The other thing would be to think about having differentials, be it loan forgiveness or actually pay differentials, based on the schools the teachers are teaching in, because that's still a major problem, recruiting teachers in general, and particularly teachers in these high-need areas into high-poverty schools.
Great, thanks. Let's take a couple questions from the audience, and then we'll go on to the next presentation. Yes?
And actually, can you wait just till the mic gets to you? Should be.
Do we have one mic?
I think
we have two. Okay, great. Can the second question ask it? Okay, it'll be in the back. Sold.
First question. Oh, right.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm Barry Stern. I'm affiliated with the Haberman Educational Foundation. And my question is I have a personal stake in this. I have a child with special needs, and we have a paucity in our district of special need teachers, especially in the area of autism and related neurological diseases. In fact, I testified about this to the Education Subcommittee of the Virginia Legislature just 3 weeks ago on this. And the paucity of talent, so I guess what I'm wondering is, have you found states, I don't think they do it in Florida, but are there states that differentiate between special ed teachers generally and people who have these specialized skills otherwise? Because what happens in our district is that there may not be a shortage in special ed, but in the area of autism, there really is. And sometimes, like my daughter has had teachers who had special ed certification who know nothing about autism, and as a result, she's wasted her time in many years. A related issue is that many of the teachers...
Keep it to one question.
Okay.
And yeah, because we just need to roll. So let's keep our questions tight.
Okay. Well, for what it's worth, many teachers, they don't complain so much about the economics of the teaching. They really worry about, they don't want to work for people who know less than they do. So we have a lot of issues of working conditions that the people who are hired, who are good, don't want to work for people who don't know as much as they do.
Yeah. So the first part of the question, I'm not aware of any states or districts that have distinguished between different types of special ed teachers. So like in Florida's program, it's actually called Exceptional Student Education, so it includes not only special ed, but gifted as well. And you're quite right that there's a high degree of turnover among special ed teachers, and the classroom situations they face vary considerably. So if you're working with, say, students with emotional and behavioral problems, may be a very different teaching environment than if you're working with kids with speech and language problems. In some other research that I've done with CALDER, Lee and I looked at certification of special ed teachers. And in contrast to the general ed literature, we found a correlation between the certification and training of special ed teachers and their impact on student achievement for students with disabilities. So it seems like the certification training is particularly important in the special ed area.
Terrific. One more question?
In the value-added calculation, do you think that the higher value-added in the, I guess it was the tuition reimbursement, I think, was because they were more likely to be teachers who were already in that, certified in that field, or did you see some other reason why that value-added difference was there?
Well, it was the loan forgiveness. We were finding that the recipients had lower value-added than people who weren't participating. Now, the measure of value-added was value-added math, so these are all teachers who were responsible for math instruction. One thing we haven't controlled for yet is the grade level. So participants are going to be middle and high school math teachers, whereas non-participants are going to be elementary teachers. And so that may be driving part of the differentials, that we may not really be comparing apples to apples there. And that's something we're going to be doing in future work.
Great, thanks. Great questions. Cory.
Okay, so is this on? Can you guys, is this on? Yes? Okay, good. Okay, so we're going to stay on the topic of retention, but shift gears a little bit and look at a more broad brush retention issue in education. So this is our annual pensions installment from the Missouri team. And I'll go in, you'll see clearly why this is about retention in a few slides. But before I get into the actual analysis specifically with this paper, I wanted to just talk for a minute about the general motivation for why the folks in this room who are worried about how kids do in school should also worry about teacher pensions. So there's two highly related issues here. The first is a large fraction of teacher compensation comes in the form of retirement benefits, like most public sector workers, and this is making the profession increasingly distinct from private sector professional jobs, at least on the dimension of compensation. Directly related to the high share of compensation that comes in the form of pension benefits is the substantial expenditures we devote to fund pension benefits for teachers. So across states, you can think in your head roughly 20% of teacher earnings are set aside to fund teachers' pension benefits. Teacher earnings are the major expenditure for public schools. That doesn't count Social Security. About 2/3 of teachers are in Social Security, so there's money going to Social Security to fund retirement benefits as well for teachers. That also doesn't count any other retirement benefits like health care or anything like that. So this is a very substantial item in budgets for schools. I would describe the research literature on pensions in education as thin. It's growing, but I would still say thin is a fair characterization. But what we're seeing is not particularly encouraging. Teachers don't seem to value their pension benefits at the cost of providing them, and the handful of studies that have tried to link the pension incentive structure to workforce quality haven't found much in the way of a link. If anything, the link is weakly negative, not the direction we'd want, but I wouldn't hang my hat on that, but certainly that's an issue. So big picture, we have high costs and questionable benefits of these systems, and so the question is, what are we getting out of these systems, and can we use these resources more effectively? So the contribution of the study today is to look at a specific policy, a pension enhancement to the retirement system for St. Louis public school teachers. The enhancement was enacted in 1999. Overnight, it resulted in a 60% increase in pension wealth for all workers, all teachers in St. Louis. So this was a generous enhancement, although not particularly uncommon. We have an earlier paper that we presented at a CALDER conference, I believe, 2 years ago, looking at pension enhancements more broadly in education. This was a very common thing that happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s. The estimated direct cost to the school district of the enhancement we're going to study today in St. Louis is $166 million. That's for the single cohort of teachers working at the time when it was enacted in St. Louis. So that's an understatement in the sense that there were also promised benefits to future cohorts of teachers. That's converted to 2013 dollars, so we can all understand what a dollar is. To give you some context for that number, the total operating budget for St. Louis Public Schools is about $500 million, a little less. So you're looking at about a third of the total operating budget of the district spent in a single year on this policy. Okay, this was a very expensive thing to do. I think it will be uncontroversial when I go through the slides here that the enhancement increased teachers' retention incentives. Pension wealth accrual in these systems is backloaded, and so you get the biggest increases late in the career. So when this type of stuff happens, it exacerbates the backloading. I'll show you some pictures of that. But slightly more controversial perhaps, but I still think it's accurate. The potential to improve retention is the only plausible policy rationale for the enhancement, certainly at a first order level. So what I mean by that, you know, if I were able to go back in time and ask the decision makers who were pushing to do this back when they were doing it, I'd say, you know, what is this going to do for kids in St. Louis? I think the only plausible thing they could say is that it would increase retention for teachers. The second order thing they could say is it would improve selection. But if I had more time, I would talk about why I think if that was what they wanted to do, this was not a good way to do it. So I don't think that's actually a very plausible explanation. If this is what they're going to do, they're going to enhance pension benefits. The main reason, the only sensible reason to give is they're going to increase retention. There's, of course, other reasons unrelated to helping kids as well, but if we were going to focus on the policy rationale, it's retention. So what we're going to do in this paper is look to see if the St. Louis enhancement increased retention. So preview of the findings in case I get rushed at the end, which is reasonably likely. Okay, so first we showed that teachers' retention incentives changed substantially. They also changed differentially. It was a 60% increase for all teachers, but because of the way the pension profile works, some teachers' pension benefits were enhanced much more than others. The basic idea is their base was there's big differences in the base. And so 60% of a very small amount is not very meaningful. 60% of a large amount is meaningful. There's also big differences in discounting that drove this. So what we do is we see these differences in the change in teachers' retention incentives, and we look to see if they resulted in a change in behavior. And breaking the findings into two groups of teachers, the first bullet point is for the policy-relevant group of retirement-ineligible teachers. Most teachers in the workforce at any given time are retirement ineligible. There are also always teachers working who are retirement eligible. But the retirement ineligible ones are the policy relevant. They're the ones who are changing their retention incentive to survive until retirement eligibility. Among them, we see these big differences in their retention incentives, how much they changed, but no differences in behavior. Okay, so I think the policy relevant result is a null result. The teachers who are retirement eligible turn out to be interesting, so they merit a bullet point here. I don't think they're of that much policy interest because they were just sort of hanging out. And what happened was the way this thing was enacted, there was a one-year gap between when it was approved and when it was enacted. And so the teachers who were retirement eligible during that gap year delayed retirement for a year so they could get the improved benefits. So I think there's a design feature story there where the thing wasn't designed very intelligently. But in terms of policy relevant behavior, I don't think them waiting a year to get the better benefit was very policy relevant. It was a very sensible thing for them to do. They definitely should have done this. We should not hold that against them. So if I had more, I'm probably not going to go through all the nuances of the empirical analysis, but one issue is our null results in the first sub-bullet there. We have fairly large standard errors, and I think that's a fair criticism. So what we can do, our preferred specification is a little noisy, so we can use a specification we don't like as much, but it gives us more precise estimates that are likely to be biased in favor of finding big retention effects. And then we can perform a cost-benefit analysis with those numbers. We can say, okay, let's say this enhancement had a bigger effect than we think. Let's do a cost-benefit analysis under that assumption and see what happens. And when we do that, even giving the benefit of the doubt to the policy, it decisively fails a cost-benefit test. So the big takeaway here is that the school district's committed to spending a lot of money for teachers' retirement benefits and didn't end up with much to show for it. Okay, so quick background on the pension issue. This applies generally to most pension plans that teachers are covered by. Okay, so teachers are mostly enrolled in defined benefit pension plans. This is changing a little bit, but it's still fair to say most teachers are in these defined benefit plans. They're characterized by a benefit formula at retirement that depends on 3 things. So the formula's up there. F is a formula factor. A number to keep in your head would be 2%. So years of service, fairly self-explanatory. That's how much time you have in the system. And then FAS is final average salary. It's usually the highest 3 to 5 years of earnings. So people will typically combine the first two terms, and call it a replacement rate. So if you have a 2% formula factor, a 30-year teacher, the pension is going to replace 60% of the final average salary. Okay, so this benefit is this stream of payments you're going to get from the point when you retire till you die. And so to put some tractability on that so we can talk about it intelligently, we're going to construct this thing we call pension wealth, which is the present discounted value of this stream of payments that you're expected to collect after you retire. And we can collapse that into a single number at any given point in a teacher's career. If we know their years of service and what their salary profiles look like so far, we can figure out their pension wealth. So we're going to do a bunch of calculations with pension wealth and pension wealth accrual over the career for teachers. And these plans are, the way this thing works, because the final average salary does not use lifetime earnings, and because of some quirks with how you can retire before the normal retirement age, the pension wealth gets heavily backloaded by these systems, and you'll see that in the pictures, and I think in one more slide. Okay, so some of the enhancements that happened in the late 1990s and early 2000s are really complicated. This one was not complicated. They just increased the formula factor by 60%. Okay, so before the enhancement, it was 0.0125. After the enhancement, they kicked up to 0.020. So this was an immediate overnight change. It was retroactive. So if you were a senior teacher and you had 25 years of service, if you retired under the old plan, your replacement rate was much lower than under the new plan. This made a big deal, a big change in pension wealth for these teachers. Okay, so visually, here's what the enhancement did. This is for a forward-looking representative age 24 teacher into St. Louis. On the left, I have the pre-enhancement pension wealth accrual profile over the course of the career. On the right, I have the post-enhancement wealth accrual curve. There are 3 lines on each graph. This is because teachers in St. Louis are in Social Security. So the red line is Social Security wealth accrual, which is not very backloaded, as you can see. That's because of how the formula for Social Security works. The dotted blue line is wealth accrual in St. Louis in the system, which is what we're going to be studying here. And then the green line is combined pension wealth. So from the teacher's perspective, what they're looking at is their total payments, and so they're going to get payments from Social Security and from the system. So what the enhancement did is increase the dotted blue line by 60%. Okay, so that's what happened. This is looking forward for the representative teacher. If you want to see all the backloading, how the backloading is so important in these plans, so this is assuming continuous work for this age 24 entrant. The age 24 entrant with continuous work will reach full retirement eligibility at age 54. That's where the spike is. Okay. If you look at wealth accrual, say, so that's about a 30-year career, 31 years actually, but if you look at the first 20 years, you can see by age 44, wealth, just sort of eyeballing off that picture, the wealth accrual is about $25,000. That's the present value of the stream of payments. Over the last 10 years, it jumps, this is in the system, sorry, the blue line. Over the last 10 years, it jumps to just under $150,000. So that's the retention incentive. And what you can see is the enhancement exacerbated that profile. It steepened the slope. The peak didn't change, the timing of the peak, but the peak got higher. And so the retention incentives increased for these teachers because of the enhancement. Okay, so let me let me get into the analysis a little bit. So what we want to do here is look to see if this retention incentive change resulted in changes in behavior. Now the pictures on the previous slide, sorry, let me go back and say one more thing. The picture on the previous slide, you should be able to see that 60% is worth more to you if you're further along, because it's just an increase on a bigger base. The other issue is if you're close to retirement, the pension payments, you're going to get them pretty soon. If you're very young, they're far away. These pictures are discounted at the same point in time. But in reality, when this happened, there's people who are going to get this enhanced pension, in a year or two. There's people who are going to have to wait 25, 30 years. So this creates big differences in how much this real change was. And so what we do with the data is we want to separate out teachers by the changes in their pension incentives and get groups with big differences to see if the differences resulted in changes in behavior. So what we do is we divide teachers into groups based on their distance from full retirement eligibility. So that's what this table is showing you. Each row is for a different group. So the first group, bin 1 teachers are retirement eligible. Okay, so there's always teachers working who are retirement eligible. Bin 2 teachers are 1 to 5 years away. Bin 3, 6 to 10. Down to bin 6 teachers who are more than 20 years away from full retirement. So those are our novices. There's a few different ways you can think about the incentive change, but one way is to think about the change in the peak value. So how much peak to peak, how much did this peak change after the enhancement happened? And so the blue highlighted column there is showing you the average change in peak value pension wealth for teachers in different bins in St. Louis. And so I've got bin 1 blocked off because they're retirement eligible, and I want to think about them separately. So focusing on the retirement ineligible workforce who haven't hit their peak yet, right? So that peak changed on them, and that's one way to think about the change in the retention incentives that they faced. You can see that sort of our teachers close to retirement eligibility, not quite there, had this big jump in their peak value, about $110,000, okay? This is driven by discounting because everyone's sort of on the same profile. And the bin 6 teachers, the change in the peak is $54,000, and that just reflects that they're very far away, okay? So that's, you can clearly see it's more than double increase, but I would argue that greatly understates the real change in pension incentives because I think the right way to think about this is the annualized return. So pension wealth, the peak jumped by $110,000 for your average bin 2 teacher, but they're on average just 3 years away from retirement eligibility. So that's a $30-something thousand a year bonus to sticking around for those few years on top of whatever the bonus was yesterday, right? So this thing just happened. There's this real strong extra incentive to stick around. For bin 6 teachers, it's $54,000, but it's 25 years away. So the annualized return there is, I would argue, is fairly modest. And so what the empirical work is designed to do is look for differential retention responses to these big differences in retention incentives. Bin 1 teachers are also floating around in here. Of course, this is a great deal for them. They're already retirement eligible. And now they put in their whole career and paid into this old formula factor, and then the formula factor just jumped on them. And, of course, they're going to have really, really big gains if they retire under the new formula instead of the old formula. So I'm not going to get too hung up discussing the methodology. It's in detail in the paper. We use a difference in difference model where we're looking at changes over time across these groups of teachers who had these different retention incentive changes. There are a few technical issues I'm not going to get too hung up on yet, but I'll just discuss them in general terms in a couple slides. I'm going to skip showing you a bunch of coefficients and standard errors. I don't think there's a whole lot of value in that. There's not very many stars is all you need to notice there. So the summary of the findings is that all those non-stars are for the retirement ineligible teachers, which just means we don't see any differences across those groups of teachers who had those big retention incentive changes in terms of their behavioral response. So we did not see a change in retention. The retirement eligible teachers, there's one little star up there in the upper right. That's for the retirement eligible teachers during the gap year. So they waited for the enhancement to take effect because it was worth a lot of money for them to do that. And so that's a very sensible thing, and that's what they did. Okay. So I mentioned, and then the two caveats, since I think I have time to sort of get them out here, I mentioned this briefly. Our preferred model has these time trends that we condition on and looks for differences in retention effects relative to the time trends, and that's a little bit costly in terms of statistical power. And so we can sort of back up to a less preferred model and get more precise estimates, but they're likely to be biased in favor of finding big effects. So we go ahead and do that just to sort of look at like sort of the best case scenario for the enhancement, and we do this in a cost-benefit framework following the recent Shetty, Freeman, and Wyckoff studies that sort of put a value on high-quality teaching, and if you link retention to experience to better teaching and all that stuff, you can do these things. And we find that even there, the enhancement was not cost-effective. And there's also the issue that our design is really built on comparing teachers within St. Louis who had a big retention incentive change to those who had a small retention incentive change, so we can't directly see what happened to those with a small retention incentive change. All of the previous literature says we should expect not much to happen, but we can use the cost-benefit framework to look at that too, and we basically, using the cost-benefit framework, we find that the effect on novice teachers of this enhancement would need to be implausibly large for it to pass the cost-benefit test. So the discussion. So first of all, I just want to, I've sort of beat this horse before, and so I apologize for getting on my soapbox again. But pension benefits were enhanced for most teachers in the late 1990s and early 2000s. This was an incredibly expensive nationwide policy reform that no one seems to have noticed. So I just want to mention it happened, and it was very expensive. So that's my soapbox. So a little less on my soapbox, but still on my soapbox. The enhancement in St. Louis was really expensive. It was a third of the total operating budget of the entire district. I mean, that's an unprecedented amount of money. you would never find an intervention in the school district in terms of a tangible educational input that would cost that much money. And I think if you did, and if someone studied it and said nothing happened, people would be really mad. But no one seems to be very mad about this pension stuff. I mean, I'm going to show you a picture at the very end. I mean, the rubber does meet the road on this stuff. It takes a while, right? They promise all these pension benefits way in the future, and so it might seem okay. The present discounted value is still $166 million. They still have to pay it. And in St. Louis, they're really paying the price today. Before I show you the final picture of what happened in St. Louis, the 3 policy implications of the study, I think most directly, you know, the world cycles, and so these pension benefits all happen when things are really good. Now things are bad. Everyone's like, oh, who would ever enhance pensions again? That was a dumb idea. Well, the world cycles. This may happen again, and I think now is the time to build an evidence base so we can react properly when the time comes. The current pension reform debates are very similar in structure to the enhancement. So the enhancement period, we improved benefits for everyone. Now what we're doing is we're paring them back, right? So I don't want to push this too much because our study's not directly informative about this. But if you believe there's symmetry to our findings, okay, I got the stop button, so I'm going to do it in 30 seconds. If you believe there's symmetry to our findings, then you would expect the current reforms to not have much of an effect. And I think big picture, our findings are consistent with evidence that teachers don't respond to their pension benefits very much. And I think that means things we're not efficiently spending resources. And there's a picture of contribution rates to the St. Louis pension plan lately, and that increases an incredible amount of money for schools, and schools in St. Louis are really struggling to deal with that.
Okay, fascinating. Tennille, have a comment or two for us?
Yes. So I really was very intrigued by this paper. 2 particular frames, one as a labor negotiator and then secondarily as a hiring official. So from a labor standpoint, immediately what I found myself wondering as I was reading this paper was what in the world was going on at this time where this was the solution. I just was very curious about the conditions there in St. Louis. I was astounded by that particular decision, and I'm trying to think that there were good reasons why they thought that was an effective solution. Something that I think that as a profession in terms of labor negotiators, again, speaking from the point of view of Washington State, something that I think we need to really get much better at is knowing why we're doing what we're doing. Developing strategies based on desired outcomes. I think sometimes you can hear somebody like, well, you wouldn't hear me say this, but somebody with my type of job feel very powerless in terms of labor negotiations, that we're just kind of at the whim and the mercy of organized labor. And I think we're definitely at a disadvantage when we're not intentional and strategic and really looking at ways to wrap in research, making decisions, I think, as a state about what we're going to stand for and what we're not going to stand for, and then allowing the chips to kind of fall as they may at the table. So I've got so much to say about that, and so I'm going to put my own stop sign and move on to the hiring official hat. Again, this lack of sophistication, I believe, on the part of districts to really talk about why people should be selecting the profession in terms of career earnings and talking about pensions. If pensions do distinguish education from other fields, we should be talking to people about why it makes sense, why the salary is only a piece of the story, and have simplified recruitment materials that really help people understand that, giving education 5, 7, 10, 15 years is something that can make a difference for their families and to help them make those choices. The second part of my hiring official reaction is, man, I would much rather have the money that's invested in pensions added to salary. And in Washington State, there is a required salary schedule, and we violate the law, the salary compliance law, if we try to modify the salary schedule, which, again, I've got a lot of, I think that's a horrible idea, just to not pull any punches there. The way that districts have gotten around salary compliance in Washington State is by supplemental compensation that's not regulated at all. So we need some policy structure to allow us to treat different positions differently. Going back to your question about delineating among special ed teachers, and do we really look at autism specialties as compared to other types of more generalized special education? Well, one of the reasons why I don't think districts do is because we are looking at all positions as being the same, and we're looking at all performance as being the same, and we probably need to stop doing that in order to get different types of results. So again, I was very intrigued, again, by why was this the solution, and why would we be investing so much money in pension when we could, and I think about our state, instead be lessening the number of steps in order to get to the top of the salary schedule so you can progress to your maximum earning, let's say in 7 years instead of closer to 15, and to have that initial starting salary be much more reflective of the types of behaviors and expertise that we expect. So instead of nickel and diming over, I'm going to pay you an additional 2 hours to get trained, let me compensate you more appropriately out of the gate, and then you've got to exhibit those professional behaviors just like you would if you were an engineer or an attorney or all these other professional careers. So anyway, stop sign again on that one.
So Cory, let's just turn that into a question for you, because I found myself wanting some context here. What was the rationale for the increase that was offered at that time? What were they selling?
So I think the right answer, the first answer I should give is I don't know. So we haven't been able to find much documentation of this, of what happened. What I will say, though...
Did you say a dark and smoky room? Is that,
but the narrative is not, whatever the narrative is, it's not this is what St. Louis needs, because this happened everywhere. I mean, it really was a national policy reform. You know, studying it a fair amount, a big piece of it is just that the pension fund balance sheets looked good. But if you do have sort of one-sided thing where every time the balance sheets look good, you take the money, and every time things go bad, of course, there's no money. That long-term, then you don't meet your average that you need to keep these things funded. So I personally think there are a lot of things unrelated to kids involved, but we wanted to take on sort of, okay, let's say this was for kids, and let's take this seriously and figure out if we can find anything. So.
Right. So in Los Angeles Unified School District, where I worked for a COO who got fired for showing this graph, more or less. So this is risky stuff in school business.
I'm tenured.
Couple questions. See, one more in the back, and keep them crisp, please. Yes.
Good morning. This is Hugo Ñopo from the Inter-American Development Bank. Thanks for the paper. You showed interesting data telling us that part of your identification comes from the difference between high and low retention incentives for individuals on that slide. But those are computations that we can do out of the law, out of the data, out of the regulations. My question is, how much do we know that teachers knew about these differences, about these computations? How able were they to understand the real incentives?
So I think that's a great question. I think that's one of the many possible, the question of understanding is one of the many possible mechanisms for why we don't see teachers respond very much to their pension benefits. And there's been several people who have pointed out this issue that people just don't really understand how much these things are worth. I think even if that's the mechanism, the policy implication, I think is the same. If you have a bunch of workers and you're giving them a bunch of stuff and they don't know they're getting it, that's not helping you do better in recruiting or helping them make better decisions. So it may very well be an understanding issue. So there's you could approach that with better education. But I think there's actually a lot of research out there that says that's going to be a big uphill battle, and not just for teachers. I mean, people just have a tough time figuring this stuff out, and maybe that's why they aren't responding.
Great.
No one understands it. When we're negotiating.
Next question, thanks.
My question is very simple. What's the impact of a teacher losing their job or getting fired because of the teacher evaluation system on their pension?
They would lose a lot of money, depending on where they were at. I mean, the wealth is backloaded. So if they had 20 years in and were pushed out, that would be very expensive for them.
At that point, or
no, you still have a pension. So you have to get vested. You don't have a pension until you get vested. That can take, vesting periods are getting pushed back, but 5 to 10 years is a good range to think about for getting vested in a typical pension plan. 10 years in some of the new tiers that are coming out in some of these states. Once you're vested, you have a pension. That big ramp up at the end is because your final average, if you get pushed out, say when you're 40, and you can't collect your pension until you're 60, that final average salary calculation is frozen, and that turns out to be really expensive. And there's also these quirks that if you stay the whole time, you can retire well before 60 or 65. And if you get pushed out early, you can't start collecting that early, and that costs you a lot of money too. So you would still get a pension payment, but you would lose a lot of it would be worth a lot less.
Great, thanks.
May I add a quick comment to that, just from the point of view of somebody that tries to fire people?
At the very end.
Yeah.
Let's come back to it. We're taking from Dan's time right now. So
Okay.
Dan, come on up.
I appreciate you running tight ship. You know you had to do that. You know.
Where is the, I'm a Mac guy, so where?
At the slideshow from beginning.
All right, perfect. And do we have also have a laser pointer? No. All right, I can at least advance. So this is some joint work with Cyrus, Grout, and Nick Huntington-Klein from the University of Washington, but really I should say that this is joint work with Tennille and Spokane, because the work that I'm going to describe comes out of a researcher-practitioner partnership grant and is also supported by CALDER, because the work could never have happened had we not maintained sort of the databases that allowed us to connect the data that Spokane provided to the state's data sets. And before I get into the substance of what we did, I just say that I'm pretty excited about the study, and I'm excited about the study for a variety of reasons. One, I think that the study is a lot. From my perspective as a researcher, it was a lot better because I was working closely with Spokane and could understand things that I would not have been able to understand had I just had a data set sitting on the computer in an office. So I think that the research was a lot better. It's also been rewarding to talk to policymakers and kind of have that back and forth between what does this mean, what might the research suggest, and what might it mean for Spokane going forward. Just by way of context, we're going to be looking at teacher selection tools, and Spokane has sort of a three-tiered hiring process is the way I would describe it, where at the first stage, folks submit their applications, and so this is just written application materials that get submitted electronically, and there's a screening process that happens based on those materials at the central office level, and the materials are screened based on a 21-point rubric, so I'll refer to this 21-point rubric. Principals say, I want to see everybody who scored above a 14 or above a 16 for a particular job opening, and so they will be advanced a number of applications, and then at the school level, the candidates are screened based on a 60-point rubric that is different from the 21-point rubric in a number of dimensions and similar in other dimensions. And then candidates that do well on the 60-point rubric go on to an interview process where there's actually a face-to-face interview that happens, and then final decisions are made. So what we're focused on is the relationship between performance on the 21 and 60-point rubrics and three outcome measures that I'll talk about in a second. But before I talk about them, just by way of background, there's actually not a ton of evidence about selection rubrics and screening processes in education or in the labor market in general. At least that is my read on the literature. And there's some mixed evidence about how effective school systems are at selecting amongst applicants. So I think that this is an important area of research, and I think it's also an important area of research because there's a ton of controversy about the way that we affect teachers that are in service, and not a ton of attention about how can we be be better proactively at getting the right people into schools in the first place to hopefully sidestep some of the controversy that arises from policies that are designed to affect in-service teachers. Probably the best study that looks at teacher selection is a study by Jonah Rockoff and some colleagues that looked at teachers in New York City, and so these are teachers that are in service, and they administered a number of, they did a number of teacher surveys. They administered some of the sort of screening tests that are often used by school systems, like I can't remember if it's the Gallup or the Haberman pre-screener. Some behavioral tests, and they've kind of put everything together and said, how much of the variation in teacher effectiveness can we explain? And when you put all the information together, it was statistically significant, but you're only explaining about 12% of the variation in teacher effectiveness. So the focus of this study I already mentioned is these two different screening rubrics, and connecting the two screening rubrics to value-added measures of teacher effectiveness in math and reading for teachers in the years after the screening occurred, teacher absence behavior, and the likelihood that teachers would leave. I'll talk about leave the district, but really everything that I say about leaving the district is consistent with leaving schools and leaving the profession. The nice thing about the work is that we have all the information about all of the applicants from Spokane. So I think it was kind of amazing just the access that we had to Spokane's database, and really I would say it's a compliment to the district that you know, they kind of opened up the piggy bank to us in a way, and we didn't know what we would find. So the news I think is good here, but it could have been bad. And so I'd say Spokane has been really good about sort of what's good, what's working, what's not working, and how can we make it better. And what's nice is that when we get all the applicants, we can see the outcomes for people that are hired in Spokane, but we can also see the outcomes for people that Spokane chooses not to hire but end up getting employed in Washington State. And of course, we have information about the people that are not employed. And that allows us to do some things statistically to try and tease out whether the relationships that we are seeing between applicant performance on these instruments and subsequent value added is in fact a causal relationship or not, which is an important question. So this is in case I don't make it through everything. So what do we see? Are the screening instruments associated with value added? And the answer is yes, particularly the 60-point screening instrument, and particularly in math. In reading, the point estimate suggests a positive relationship, but it is only marginally significant. In terms of relationships with absences, no, almost no relationship with teacher absences, and a strong relationship for both the 21 and 60-point screening instruments with teacher attrition. So again, I think that things could be improved, but the sort of the basic message is that what Spokane is doing looks like it is associated with the kinds of outcomes that the district cares about. And I'll talk a little bit about that if I have time. So the main data source is information on applicants from Spokane Public Schools. We merge this with state databases and data from NCES and data on teacher absences for the rest of the state outside of Spokane that comes from another source. So here's a visual depiction of the pipeline, and this is just to kind of give you a sense of how many people are making it through different points in the pipeline. And actually, these are not people. These are those are not actual people here. These are applications. So there are roughly 2,700 or so individual teachers that over the 4 years of our data apply to Spokane for 538 positions. So Spokane, as Tennille kind of hinted at earlier, is not unique in Washington State, but is a district in Washington State that has kind of a plethora of applications relative to a lot of districts. you can see from the fact that there are 4,200 applicant years that there are people that are applying, more than once or to more than one school. Roughly half of them get screened out based on the 21-point rubric, and then there's another cut of about 40% before people get interviewed. I'm going to skip over this. This is the 21-point rubric and focus a little bit more on the 60-point rubric. So the 60-point rubric is based on these 10 different criteria. You'll notice at the top it says that it's a 54-point rubric because in the second 2 years of the data, they added an additional component that was worth 6 points. So you're rated on each of these 10 components as being 1 to 6. So your total rating can range from 6 to 60. And you probably can't read any of these things, but there are prompts that give the raters a sense of what they are looking for on all of these different components. But I would say that one of the areas where perhaps the district can improve is that it's pretty clear that when you look at inter-rater reliability, that there's better inter-rater reliability on some of the components than on other components. So it's a different aspect of the study, but the prompts perhaps could be strengthened in some ways. Something else that's worth noting, these are the correlations amongst on the right-hand panel, the different components on the 60-point screening rubric and the 21-point screening rubric. And if you look at the areas where there's that are boxed off in red, that there are a lot of very high correlations. So on this instrument, they're asking different questions about candidates, but they are probably getting at some of the same underlying concepts, traits of people. And so even though nominally each of these components is weighted 1 to 6 and equally weighted, in fact, there's not equal weighting to these different concepts that they're getting at about teachers. So what I've done here is I put just some mean values for all of the applications on the far left column, and then information about the means for those who get the 21-point screen in the next column, the means for those who get the 60-point screen in the next column, those who make it to the interview stage, those who are hired or offered a position. And those things, importantly, are not quite synonymous, but close to synonymous because 95% of the teachers, 95% of the offers are accepted, right? So Spokane gets the people that are offered jobs. And the means for those that are hired elsewhere, and I'm going to point out just a couple things. If you look at experience in amongst all the applicants, the mean experience level is 0.11 years versus 0.43 for those who are offered. So Spokane favors people who have some teaching experience. Favors folks that did their student teaching in the district. So 36% of the applicants did some student teaching in the district. 47% of those that were hired or offered a job. The West B score is the licensure test. It's the basic skills test in Washington State. It's normalized across the whole state. The applicants have a mean West B that's a little below average for the state, but what's covered up is that if you look at those that are hired, they have it's covered up on mine too. I can't remember I don't know. I can't remember what this says, but I know that it's higher than 0.07, right? So Spokane is hiring people that score better on the licensure tests. So what do? We estimate basic value-added models of teacher effectiveness. I won't talk more about it than that. And then we regress value-added against these screening scores, either the 21-point score or the 60-point score or the 21 and 60 together, or the different components of each of those different instruments. And then we estimate logit models of 1 and 3 year attrition. Same deal. We're looking to see at the relationship between performance on the screening instruments and the probability that teachers are leaving the district. And then linear models looking at days absent and or absent on Monday or Friday. So, okay, what do I want to say here? Here are the coefficient estimates. The important thing to notice is if you look in the upper left panel, math value added, that is the .064 is the point estimate, 2 stars for math value added and its relationship to the 60-point screening score. If you estimate models with school fixed effects, it's no longer statistically significant, and I think there's some good reasons why. Positive but insignificant effects in reading, and positive and significant effects for district attrition, which is in the lower right, and no relationship with absences. So quickly, as I'm running out of time, so what does this mean? Here are the value-added distributions for the distributions of value-added for teachers that scored in the lowest quartile on the screening instrument. Again, hired in Spokane or hired elsewhere, and that's the blue line, and those that scored in the highest quartile of on the screening instrument, on the 60-point screening instrument. And the drop-downs are the means of each of those distributions. And so the difference here is 24% of a standard deviation of student achievement. So that is a really significant difference. Here are the results for reading. There's a lot more overlap in these distributions, but still there's a significant difference in these means. For some perspective, these are the estimated returns to teacher experience in Washington State. So the dashed blue line is the distribution of novice teachers, and the solid green line is, I'm a little colorblind, so I think it's green, but the solid line is the distribution for teachers with 4 or more years of experience. That's a statistically significant difference, but it's about 5% of a standard deviation. I'm going to skip over the results for absences because, again, they're not significant. Here are the estimates. Actually, these aren't estimates. These are just what does the attrition rate look like for teachers in 1, 2, 3, and 4 years out for those who scored in the bottom quartile of this instrument versus the top quartile. And you can see that the line is significantly lower, i.e. there's lower attrition if you score in the top quartile on the 60-point instrument or on the 21-point instrument. And these are, to my mind, really sizable differences in attrition. Skip through that. Okay. A big issue that comes up when you're looking at the screening instruments, I won't be able to go into the details here, but you might expect that teachers that get hired despite not doing very well on an instrument like this might be different from teachers that do well and get hired in ways that you can't pick up with the data, right? So like if someone scores poorly on these instruments and gets hired anyway, maybe it's because they just knocked it out of the park in the interview. And there's no data that we're taking from the interview. So the nice thing about having all applicants is that you can estimate a Heckman two-step sample selection correction. You can try and get a sense of whether the estimates that you're getting are real causal estimates of the relationship between your performance on these screening instruments and, in this case, teacher effectiveness. And what you have to buy is that there's something that predicts the likelihood that teachers get hired and doesn't predict subsequent effectiveness. Right? And so oftentimes it's very hard to find an instrument that satisfies this. What was nice, and this is part of the reason why working closely with Spokane enabled some research that you wouldn't otherwise be able to do, is there are mistakes on the screening instrument. And again, I compliment Spokane for being very upfront. This was done on paper. And so we had all the PDFs, and we could total cases where the truth about how well teachers or applicants did was different from the score that was reported and used for hiring. So there were errors. And we could use those errors to say, look, they affect the likelihood of getting hired in Spokane, and they do. But if it's just purely an arithmetic error, then it shouldn't affect how effective someone is down the line. And so it's a really kind of convincing instrument. And also, there's a nice test to see whether this works, because the errors should predict the likelihood of getting hired in Spokane, but they shouldn't predict the likelihood that you get hired anywhere else, and in fact they don't. I'm getting the stop. So I'll just end up by saying that when you use this methodology, it looks like the performance on the screening instrument is causally related to later teacher effectiveness.
Maybe you should do some about the principles that can add up to 60.
It's fair.
Terrific. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, so I debated whether or not to give Tennille the first word, since this is kind of like extending Dan's presentation, but I will. Please.
So my first comment is that we now have a locked spreadsheet that forces correct arithmetic. So that's important to start with. It was a really nice partnership with Dan and Cyrus for a variety of reasons. Well, first, we were glad. We didn't know what we'd find. We thought that we would find some good things, but there was a risk that we wouldn't. So it was rewarding to know that there were some things that we were doing well. More significantly, though, we got good information about pieces of our process that we could invest more time and attention in, and pieces that we could kind of back off on, because one of our goals, and the timing of the study was perfect, actually, or the results. One of our goals is to dramatically increase the speed, the timing of our hiring process. We're actually trying to cut it in, we want it to be 25% of what it is now. That's our goal for the first day of school this year. So it was helpful to be able to say, okay, well, gosh, the 21-point rubric, there's some good things there, but the 60-point rubric is really what matters most. I'm simplifying, and obviously I'm not a researcher. So what are some ways that we can require certain fields like training and experience and WESD certification information on our application? Those weren't required fields before. Those were optional fields. So you can't submit the application if you haven't provided that information out of the gate, which means it's not something that other screeners need to actively look for, because they could sort through it electronically. So we've found some ways there. We also have really focused more on the information that's garnered through the letters of recommendation, and made that a process by which it's now a blind process. So people that submit letters of recommendation, those are confidential now for all teachers. And the conditions that we want are people to tell us the truth. Instead of speaking in code about someone's growth potential because they're trying to maintain a relationship, which I think is very real in education, they're able to be a lot faster and say, don't hire this person. Or maybe in a year, this person will be where you need them to be. So we're seeing that teachers are a little bit nervous about that process, but we're seeing already really encouraging honesty from administrators who are no longer needing us to really read through the lines, though we think we were pretty good at that. It's a lot easier to know what people actually think. So those are some initial thoughts.
Great. So Dan, does it look like Spokane does a better job hiring than the surrounding districts?
No pressure.
This is my anecdotal take on this, because I don't think we know systematically, what is the hiring process in most school systems. But I think Spokane has a much more sophisticated process that makes it less likely that you're going to have, you're going to hear about someone's, niece, and just hire them because, someone said they were terrific. That's a piece of information, which is probably valuable, but the process in Spokane makes that kind of sort of more ad hoc hiring. You can't do it, right? You can't do it. You have to look at everybody that scores at a certain level. So I would say the answer is yes, that Spokane's hiring is more sophisticated and more effective.
Great. How much of that is that they focus on more experienced teachers? Did your model adjust for that?
Yeah, it's not primarily associated with the experience.
Yeah.
So I didn't get a chance to talk about it, but there are these 10 different components on the screening rubric, and some of the components were much more correlated with value added and attrition than others. Important caveat is that Spokane may well care about lots of things other than just value added and attrition. So the fact that we did not find a relationship between some of the components and those outcomes doesn't say that those components are necessarily worthless. It just says that they may be picking up something else.
Great, great, terrific. Couple questions. How about in the back and up front?
Hi, Javier Luque from the IDB. One quick question. Do we know if these rubrics affect where teachers are placed among the schools in Spokane, and in which classroom do they get? Do teachers that get good rubric go to the good class, good behavior kids, or bad kids? I mean, do we know something on that? Or how that may affect the results of this?
So hopefully it does not reflect, it does not affect the results that I presented, in the sense that the value added is hopefully an unbiased estimate of the effectiveness of teachers, but it does look like there is some sorting of teachers into different buildings and into different classrooms. And I think that that's just reflective of what you tend to see in the labor market. So, for instance, on this 21-point screen, there are schools that tend to be the more advantaged schools that have somewhat higher application averages than the more disadvantaged schools on the 21-point instrument. So that's, in some sense, given the constraints that Spokane is operating under, somewhat outside of the district's control, because it's about where applicants choose to apply.
Great. Sonny.
Helen, or Sonny Ladd from Duke University. I want to follow up on your measure, the value-added measure, and you just responded in part. You've come up with a relatively sophisticated value-added measure, but we know we can't estimate those for subjects other than math or reading. So, and we can use it most in grades 3 through 8. So, first question is the analysis here applicable only to teachers you're hiring in those grades? You know, how do you deal with people you're hiring in other grades? And then secondly, and you referred to this briefly, I'm quite skeptical of putting too much emphasis on gains in test scores. I mean, there are lots and lots of other things teachers do. So could you just talk about those two issues?
So the value-added results that I described are for the set of teachers for whom we can calculate value-added. The absence results and the attrition results are for the entire district. We had hoped to use information from the district's performance, more holistic performance assessment of teachers, but like, many districts in the country, there's no variation. Not all, but nearly all teachers are effective. And so, I think that my response often to questions like this is, well, I think there's certainly information in value added, but it's not the be-all, end-all. The problem is, if there's no variation in any other outcome, then you can't use any other outcome to assess, interventions like this.
That's fair. Jim.
So I want to acknowledge my co-authors, Susanna Loeb and Luke Miller. Luke's in the back today. I also want to acknowledge a long-standing partnership with the New York City Department of Education, which has been greatly helped by the assistance financially and otherwise from CALDER, that we've been able to maintain this long-standing relationship. And so the topic of the paper I want to share with you is generally about performance screens for teachers, but more specifically about teacher tenure and a reform policy that occurred in New York City. So I probably don't need to go on in any kind of detail about the debates, the conceptual and theoretical debates about the importance of tenure. Advocates for tenure have worries about the arbitrary and politically motivated dismissal of teachers. Critics would suggest that, in fact,
because we don't take tenure decisions seriously, as was alluded a minute ago, almost everybody is determined to be effective. We have a number of people who are truly not effective who receive tenure, and then the due process requirements associated with tenure become very difficult, make it very difficult for those teachers to ever be removed. There's a long history associated with tenure going back more than a century. It was contentious back then, 100 years ago, and as it remains contentious now, and we've got a number of court cases to document how contentious it is today. And so the policy over the last few years has been really on two tracks in terms of changing tenure. One is to eliminate tenure, and a number of states are moving or have moved in the direction of eliminating tenure for teachers. Other states are moving to try to make tenure more rigorous. And so they're upping the requirements of data that are required for teachers to receive tenure, and it remains, I think, an open question as to how effective and really whether more rigorous methods are actually being applied. And so we are interested in trying to take advantage of a policy change that occurred in New York City in 2009. And the policy change was part of a larger set of reforms that occurred in New York City under the Klein administration at that point. The basic thrust of many of those reforms were to empower principals over who works in their schools and then hold principals accountable for the performance of their schools. And so it was a strategy that attempted in many ways to change policies so that principals could hire who they wished and make it easier for them to opine on, at tenure time and at other places, whether or not teachers should remain in their schools. And so that larger set of policies took one of those policies was related to the reform of tenure in New York City. And the basic idea around tenure policy in New York City, much before the Klein reform, at tenure time, teachers could either be approved for tenure, which typically 95% of the teachers had been approved for tenure. They could be denied tenure, and typically 2 or 3% of teachers were denied tenure, or they could have their probationary period extended for a year and be told that right now you don't meet the standards for tenure, come back in a year and we will reevaluate you for tenure. The principal recommends tenure decisions, and superintendents ultimately decide. So under the reform, which began, as I said, in 2009-10, there was a much greater emphasis on providing principals with more and presumably better information about the performance of their teachers. And I won't read to you each of the components of this information that were then infused into the system in 9-10, but it involved a number of things, including value-added measures for the teachers for whom value-added could be collected, but there were also classroom observations, and the district in that year provided guidance to principals for a very small subset of teachers that said, the tenure for this teacher is in doubt. That is, and if you disagree with that, you have to justify providing tenure for that teacher, because we've indicated, based on the information that's available to us, that tenure is a doubtful thing, and there should be other information that you possess over and above the information that's readily available from what we're providing you that would suggest tenure should occur. On the other hand, there were a group of teachers who received tenure-likely designations, and it was just the reverse. If you plan not to give tenure for this teacher, you have to justify that. The information that occurred, that was provided to principals during the subsequent years, changed. Teachers in 10-11 were all rated as highly effective, effective, developing, or ineffective. Those were ratings that were provided by the principals. And there were, rather than the guidance, the tenure likely, the tenure in doubt, in 10-11 that was replaced by flags. And so certain pieces of information were flagged to the principal. They no longer had to justify the tenure in doubt, tenure likely designations. And in 11-12 and 12-13, which are the last years for which we have data, in 11-12 there was the value-added measures were not available in time for principals to employ them, so there were no value-added measures at that time. And in 12-13,
is a time when we switched from the district calculating value added was being calculated statewide, and these were growth rates that replaced the value added measures. So this gives you some sense of the information that principals received as they were making the determinations of who should get tenure. So we wanted to explore a few questions related to the tenure decisions. And first of all, did it make any difference that principals were getting all this information? Did it change the prevalence of teachers who were approved for tenure, extended, or denied? We also wanted to understand if there were some changes, which teachers were being affected and what were the attributes of those teachers, and how did that change the composition of teachers who continued to teach in New York City. And finally, we wanted to explore what differences might exist across schools within the system. So the data we have for this, and again, I'm really appreciative to the folks in New York City for being so forthcoming with all the information that was provided to principals we received, and so we understood exactly what principals were getting when they made these recommendations. And we had a bunch of other information that we've had a long-standing relationship with New York City around administrative data. So we have lots of information about all the teachers in the city, information about the students of those teachers. Their achievement allows us to calculate our own value-added measures. So here's the short version of the answer to the first question. Prior to this reform, 94% of all teachers were approved for tenure. After the reform, that dropped to 56% of teachers. So this is, within a couple years, a very remarkable change in the percentage of teachers who received tenure approvals when they first came up. And in New York, you were come up for a tenure decision during your third year of teaching. As you can see, the proportion of teachers who were denied tenure changed very little, went from 2% to 3%. The big change, however, was going from 4% of teachers who were extended to 41% of teachers who were extended. So 41% of teachers were told, you don't meet the standards that we have to be tenured. We will work with you over the next year to help you get there, and we will evaluate you again a year from now. I'd like you to focus, since we're primarily focusing on the teachers who were extended relative to those that were approved, focus on the first two rows. And what you see highlighted in yellow are variables for which the differences between those who were extended and those who were approved are significantly different. And what you can see there is that the teachers who were approved had substantially better metrics on almost all these measures. The one that stands out is for the teachers for whom we have value added, we were a subset of that larger group. The differences there on average are 38% of the standard deviation. I mean, this is just a huge difference in performance between the people who were approved and the people who were extended. And here's how this played out among schools. And so we wanted to understand, so this sort of hides two facts, right? So what you see here is relatively large differences in the proportions of teachers who were approved for tenure. But nonetheless, more than 70% of the schools approved fewer than 80% of their teachers. So most of the schools had a dramatic change from the prior approval rates of 94% to no higher than 80%. But you see that varies a lot. And that, of course, can mask two things. One, we may just have a maldistribution of teachers. So some of these schools had many more less effective teachers, and therefore they were rightly, under this system, determined to be relatively less effective and therefore got extended. The other thing that may be going on here, and this is one of the things we're going to follow up on, is that these policies may be implemented differentially in some schools relative to others. And we want to understand more about that if it's occurring. Here are the attributes of the students who exist in the schools for the average approval, the average extended. So what you see here, the one thing that struck us, and I'll come back to a little bit later, is that on average, teachers who are approved are in schools that have a higher percentage of white students and a lower percentage of African American students. So this is a policy that is differentially affecting African American students. Again, that connects to the point I just made a minute ago. That may be because those schools had, on average, less effective teachers. And there's lots of evidence to suggest from many of the people who are in this room that that is not a surprising result. And you see this across some of the other measures as well. So here, this graph gives you a first look at how the composition of continuing teachers might change. And so what it shows you is that we went from 90% of the teachers who were approved staying in their same school in the 10-11, 11-12 school years. For those who are extended, that number drops down to 75%. So immediately following the tenure decision, what proportion of those people remain in their same school? 90% of the people who are approved do, 75% of those who are extended do. So it's suggesting that, in fact, this decision about being extended has influenced teachers' attrition behavior. We wanted to explore that in a somewhat more rigorous way, and so we ran a bunch of regressions, making different assumptions about what to control for. In all of these regressions, we control for student attributes, and as you can see across some of the columns at the bottom of the graph here, some of these we're controlling for school fixed effects, so we're only comparing teachers who were extended and approved within the same schools. And in other cases, we're controlling for both that and the principal's effectiveness rating. And what you see here is that the increased attrition rate of extended teachers relative to those who are approved, who are the control group here, are 50% higher. And so this suggests that labeling these people as extended has increased their attrition from either the system, that's the exit, or from the school, which is the transfer, by 50 percentage points. So it's a big change in their behavior in response to this policy. We also then said, okay, well, that's interesting, but who is going to replace these teachers who just left? If we're not getting teachers who are any better, then this is a policy that hasn't done much for us. And so what these regressions show you is the comparison between what we call proxy replacement teachers. We don't know, we don't have enough data that allow us to see who actually went to these schools, but we come up with a proxy replacement. It's described in the paper. I don't have time to give it to you now. But basically what we see is the difference between the proxy replacement teachers and the ones who leave are substantial. So for example, if you look at the first row there, all extended leavers, 45 percentage point difference between the proxy replacement teachers being rated either highly effective or effective relative to the proportion who were rated that under the extended leavers. Their value added in ELA is 20% of a standard deviation higher and significant. The math is not significant for all leavers, but is for those who transfer. So I think we have good evidence that the people who are leaving are being replaced by teachers, at least in the judgment of the principals who are making those highly effective and effective ratings, as being meaningfully better. So I'm not going to go through and read all these. I just sort of told you what these outcomes were. This policy had a big change in terms of the outcomes. It was differentially more effective for black students in their schools because those were the places where these extended teachers were disproportionately housed, and those teachers then got replaced by people who we believe are substantially better. So I want to conclude by saying that this is a first look at the effects of this policy. You could imagine that over a long period of time, we might see somewhat different results. For example, if teachers come to believe they will always be extended, okay, I didn't make it this year, I got extended, and you can be extended for multiple years, then it may not affect behavior. And there are other reasons to believe that you might end up with different outcomes over the long run. We are interested in pursuing this to see what happens, but we're also interested in trying to understand how we can get inside of what's going on in these decisions. So we're in the midst of beginning a project to survey all the principals in New York City around the various policies. Tenure is one of them, but there are 3 other policies that we think contribute to principals' ability to either change the composition of the teachers who exist in their schools or increase the capacity or effectiveness of those teachers. And we want to understand how principals develop strategies. That graph I showed you a few minutes ago about the differences in schools for the uptake of this policy suggests to us that some principals may be using these policies in ways that are very strategic to try to improve the teaching effectiveness that goes on in their schools, whereas other principals may not be. And we want to understand what it is that those principals are doing and how they're thinking about using these policies, including the tenure policy, to affect those outcomes. Thanks.
Perfect. Thanks, Jim. Tennille.
So on the heels of a change to the evaluation law for teachers and principals in Washington State, I was fascinated by this paper. One of the things that struck me initially was the way that it appeared that in New York city schools, public schools, that they're thinking about tenure in a more active way than I think we do in Washington State. So I was struck even by the language and really that meeting the criteria for tenure, we approach it in the reverse, which is we're just much more passive about someone becoming tenured or permanent is the language that we would use in Washington. So I think that's something that we really need to be striving for at Spokane Public Schools is helping people to really have those conversations, like the extended conversation, the basis of that, which is you're not there yet. I think that you can get there. I'm committed to working with you for 1 more year. We've got 3 years of provisional status in Washington. I would love that type of conversation to be occurring between principals and teachers all the way through that probationary status until they get into permanent status. Also, the behavior changes among principals and those who are extended is fascinating to me. So again, it seems to be that the difference maker for principals was needing to explain why you were deviating from the recommendation of the central office and that you had to justify that to the superintendent. So I imagine what's a way that we create those conditions for principals by which they're saying, I really want to go to bat for this person, or the results that you're seeing from this person are not what I'm seeing. And again, make that much more of a two-way, overt conversation. And I think the more that the district stands behind that and is clear that this is a policy direction that we're going, then we remove some of the factor that can play out in our unionized environment, which is this principal's super mean and this principal isn't, and we're focused more on somebody being retaliatory than, no, this is an overt decision by the organization in order to be more effective. So I think lots of really interesting ramifications. What you want to do next in terms of diving deeper into what principals are doing and what separates the most effective principals from those who are less effective are things that I look forward to learning about.
Great, thanks. So Jim, in New York City, there's a new mayor, there's a new chancellor.
I do this coming.
It sounds like an opportunity to study. I don't know if you saw the New York Times a couple weeks ago, Sunday Times. The story was front page story, and it started with this description of Chancellor Farina walking into a room of district officials who've got data up on the wall, having a conversation around school effectiveness, and she basically shut the conversation down and said, I know a good school when I see it. That's going to be our criteria going forward. I'm paraphrasing, but what would your message to her be based on what you're seeing in these data?
Softball, right? What has been our message to? So we, as I said, we're continuing to work with senior policy folks in the New York City Department of Ed who I think valued the work that we did, even as we presented it as it rolled out with the new administration. I think they're interested in trying to figure out how to improve the quality of teaching in those buildings. And so while there may be some differences of opinion about, I think she doesn't much care about value added at all, doesn't think it's a useful metric, and I think she's expressed, as she did, about the usefulness of data or the lack thereof. I think that while clearly this is a different approach to the use of data that existed under the Klein administration, my sense is that at least among senior policy folks in the city, there is still a take-up of good evidence about how things can be done better. I think they're not excited about the sort of gotcha moment, right, where you come on and say, oh, look how awful these teachers are, and, you know, the publication of value-added scores and all the negative things that get associated with this. I think they are interested in trying to use data to help improve what goes on there.
Great, thanks. A couple questions. Reagan. And then Eric. We've got some mics. There it comes.
Reagan Miller, Teach for America. So, Jim, really interested in some potential extensions, and these may be things you're planning. One, it seems like there's probably enough principal turnover to tease out differences in principal behavior based on whether they were there for the hiring as well as the tenure type decisions. And the other, obviously, I'd be interested in whether you'll tease out differences in the way the teachers behave based on their segment of the pipeline coming in.
Yeah, so both good suggestions, and yes, we are planning on doing that. I will say that as part of this new work, we're going to be surveying not just principals, which I alluded to, but surveying teachers to get their perspective on what constitutes sort of effective principal strategies around improving the quality of teaching. And so I think we're really interested in trying to understand the mechanisms that might account for some of what we saw, but also better understand with the data we have some of the details. So I think the things you're suggesting resonate with, I think, where we're going.
Great. We've got a question in the back first, and then we'll come back up front.
Maria Ferreira from the World Bank. So a question with the New York City reform. What incentives did the principals have to classify teachers differently? Why wouldn't they classify everybody as being tenured? Were they rated based on the effectiveness of their teachers or on the performance of their students?
Yeah, great question. And so they were held accountable for the performance of the students in their building. And this is also a change that's occurred since the new administration, but each school building was giving a letter grade. And a good part of that letter grade related to the performance of students. And so very directly, principals were being held accountable for the performance of their teachers in that way. And their evaluation depended on not just the way they rated teachers, but on the overall performance of schools, which clearly is connected to the performance of teachers.
Great. One last question.
Rick Hanashek from Stanford. I couldn't understand exactly how to interpret transfers. You extend teachers, there's a higher transfer rate. The people who come in are better than the people who leave, but it's a zero-sum game for transfers. So the general equilibrium is no change, except that you've increased the variance in the quality of schools, probably, that some principals take advantage of extending and pushing out teachers from their schools, but they're going someplace else.
That's exactly right. And so some of those teachers who were extended and transferred may have filled a place where a teacher had been extended and left. So that's true. But there are lots, I mean, New York City is a huge place, right? And so there are lots of vacancies that have nothing to do with this process and therefore would not have been accounted for in the results that I showed. So yes, there is this issue about whether it, and I think there's legitimate questions about whether teachers who may not perform well in one context could perform well in a different context, right? And part of that might be, different teaching assignments. Part of it might just be a different environment. And so we have not looked at that, which clearly is something we could look at.
Yeah, that's really interesting because that issue of fit that you described, but there's also, you're comparing against who would have been hired, and I think that's the counterfactual. It's who would have been in that place that the transfer went to, and that conceivably could have been, if it's a high-need school or a different situation, it could be conceivably worse than. I I'm going to wave a magic wand. We are done with our session-by-session questions, and now I would like you to be thinking about the whole panel and the implications across. If you have questions for individual panelists, feel free to call that out. But we're going to start, I'm going to ask Tennille to reflect across this series of papers from her school district role, and then very quickly we'll transition to your questions.
One reflection about the series of papers relates to all of the people in the state of Washington who do the type of work that I do. So when I return to Spokane next week, we're having our annual conference for personnel administrators. And so as I've been listening to the conversation, and I've enjoyed hearing the people, I got the chance to read the papers in advance, and it was fun to also hear you share the information in person. I've been thinking about how can I share what's been beneficial about this experience for me, how can I share it with my colleagues, and what would it look like? How would my colleagues react to this panel of people coming? Usually we're focused on violating the law or not as it relates to, discrimination and all sorts of things that I think bog us down and pull us away from important talent management pieces. So that's when I have been thinking for probably the last 15 minutes, how can I create a space for bringing my colleagues into this type of conversation, which I think is necessary among education leaders. Generally, it's been our counterparts in teaching and learning that are really focused on research and making decisions based on research. I don't see that as much in human resources, among human resources professionals, which is counterintuitive because of the important role that teachers and principals play in benefits for students. So that's one thing. How can I share this information with my colleagues to see if we can change the profession, which is kind of a lofty goal, but why not?
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it struck me as I've thought about these papers is, they're all taking on an important policy question, and they seem like big questions from a researcher perspective. I mean, these are really big. Putting on my district central office hat, though, these are just small slices of all the things that I need to worry about. And I actually could not imagine having the time to get through all these papers and pull out the implications as I'm running a school district. I mean, I couldn't imagine that. And so I'm wondering maybe this is CALDER's role, maybe this isn't, but I'm wondering who's standing in that gap between the researchers who have wonderful insights that are hugely policy relevant, and the person sitting in the superintendent or research or human relations seat, who's combining it in a way and packaging it in a way that's easy to consume. And I don't know if you track what happens to your research as it goes beyond publication or not, but I'd love to hear Dan's perspective on just the general, how do we make this more consumable? And then if anybody else has a comment on that, I'd love to hear that as well.
Mostly, I would say that I think that it's a real struggle, and that, working sort of one-on-one and actually having the opportunity to have conversations with individuals and build up a trusting relationship feels huge in terms of the potential to affect policy. But I know that there are institutions in this country that are supposed to serve this role, the regional education labs to some extent, comprehensive centers, etc. I don't know how well that is working, and I think that that's something that CALDER is talking about as a group, is how can we be more proactive and better at it. But I don't have a good answer.
Gotcha. Other ideas from the rest of the panel?
You look like you're about to say something.
Yeah. So I think, Steve, it's a great question, and my sense is that these are the kinds of conversations I have with people in New York City. I have them with people in D.C., and so but I'm not sure, as Dan alluded, how you generalize this in a way where it's sort of, you scale this up to the need that exists in terms of the districts. And So I think it is something that, we at Calder could think more about in terms of trying to create more comprehensive, not just a policy brief about Dan's paper or Tim's paper, but a policy brief around, retention of effective teachers. And it becomes a 4-page summary of what we think we know about that. And, to some extent, those things exist in academic literature reviews, but they are often 30 pages, and that defeats the purpose that you identified. So, I think it's a good question, and I think there are ways that we ought to be thinking about it.
Terrific. Give a last chance for the panel before I turn over to general questions.
I would encourage you to think of ways to make the information more consumable for school district leaders, because we are asking the questions that you are working to answer. We just may not be aware of it, and it should absolutely be factoring into our plans and decisions, 3, 6, 9 years in advance, and I generally think in terms of the length of collective bargaining agreements that I would like to have in place. So there should be a way, I know that it's affecting my behavior, there should be a way that we, spend a little bit of time in a room together thinking about what are the implications of your research on our work, and then that gives us a much better position to communicate in a consistent way with our local lawmakers.
One thing we did with the Measures of Effective Teaching project is we actually did our first presentations with our partner districts, and by and large they told us we don't understand anything you're saying, and we were so far off. They're like, look, you're not talking about the core issue. You're talking in language that isn't our language. Can we do this over? And literally for every single report, we had 2 meetings. The first meeting where we said, here's what we think we know. The districts pushing back and saying, try that again, and then we came back to them and with a fresh presentation, and it made a huge difference, I think, in the translatability of our work. I think it ended up speaking more in practitioner language. It ended up focusing on the things that they cared about. And so that ended up being even more of a partnership. We'd start out thinking that this was going to be a good partnership. We didn't realize how much they were going to push the researchers and the practitioners pushing the researchers. It was just fabulous. So let's turn it over to the audience. We're going to have to run mics quickly.
Yes, I'm, again, Barry Stern, affiliated with the Haberman Foundation. One of the issues, and to address the last question of one of the parts of the territory as an analyst, is you end up knowing more and more about less and less until you know practically everything about very little. And Dan, I was struck by your comment in your introduction that you said only 12% of the variance of teacher effectiveness was discovered through these screening things.
That's based on Jonah Rockoff et al.'s work, but yeah.
Right. Okay. So I'm thinking of 4 districts: Houston, San Diego, Cleveland, and Kansas City. These were 4 of the 5 top candidates for Superintendent of the Year last year. All of whom use a Haberman protocol for selecting teachers and administrators. Terry Greer being the winner in Houston. Has used that extensively. He's turned over 70% of his administrative staff. Now, of course, these superintendents don't work in a vacuum. I mean, this is not a silver bullet. They're also excellent managers. They have some vision. It's not only about using the Haberman protocol, but how they do it, and how they if with Terry Greer, if you don't do it, you're gone. But he's also a student of human nature. He was a personal friend of Martin Haberman before he passed away 2 years ago. So these are not they're just not using techniques. Again, it gets back to the whole being more than the sum of the parts. This is one of many things that they're doing to improve effectiveness. Now, Pat Forgione is a former superintendent in Dallas. Maybe he could speak to this about what would be useful. Or Austin, I'm sorry, for Austin. It's, again, I think you really raise an important question. It's what's going to really make a difference, and it's usually a combination of things as opposed to any one single silver bullet.
Great. We have a question back.
Yeah, I'm a person who works at a state education agency, so ostensibly my job would be to translate your work. And I have a question for each one of you, which is just, I'm from Wisconsin, so that's none of the states that you studied. So how would each of you answer the question about how is your research valid, or what from your research could I apply when making decisions in my state? It's a kind of a question where every state and district thinks that they're unique and special, and I think you really have to say what parts of you are unique and special, and what parts of you does research in New York really speak to, or research in Washington. So if you could each talk about that just really briefly, I think I'd be really interested to hear that.
So I guess I'll begin and quickly say, I think probably districts and states are less unique and special as they often think they are. And so I'm struck by how parochial policymakers are. And the argument is often we're unique and special, so we can kind of ignore what's going on and what's learned elsewhere, and that's a mistake, would be the first thing. I do think that there are unique circumstances, but the parochialness works against us in this country in terms of learning about what works for kids. But I would just say that I think for all of these, for everything that we touched on, what I'm most struck by is actually something that Tennille said, which is that we're not thinking about this as human, resource people, because we've got a million things to do. And so I think that sometimes some of these kinds of issues that are like fundamentally important for the outcomes for kids get sort of pushed to the side because because there's a lot of compliance stuff that needs to get taken care of.
So I will just tag on to that. I think Dan's exactly right. And I would also say that I think most of these policies, certainly the tenure policy that I discussed, is a policy that can be implemented almost anywhere. It's sort of unlike some of the things that are being done. So, for example, we're in D.C. D.C. has initiated a set of reforms that I don't think are transferable to too many other places, just given the bargaining agreements and other things. It is a great proof of concept about some issues, but I'm not sure it's portable. The tenure paper, I think, is portable anywhere. It just says we want people to have better information. And I think, so going back to Steve's question earlier, I think that's the message that we ought to be writing up in these briefs, is sort of, here are the results. It can make a big difference, and anybody can do this. You just want to use good information to make these decisions.
I'll just quickly echo what Jim said. I feel like the answer to that question is related to the previous discussion, which we need to do a better job of communicating this stuff. And I think some stuff is pretty narrow, but most of it generalizes, and I think maybe that's a failure of the research community in translating stuff to policy folks, that this stuff does generalize, and we could write things in a way to do a better job of characterizing that.
I'm sorry, just one other thing.
As a researcher, you kind of a delicate line, right? Because someone says, well, could it be different in state X? And the answer is, yeah, it could, right? Like, we don't know everything that's going on, so yeah, it could. And then, so there's this delicate balance between being intellectually honest, right, but saying, but we don't think it is, right? And so there are implications.
Hi. So my question is fairly specific to the tenure discussion, but I think that it might have implications for others. From what I understand of the literature, it seems that most teachers reach their peak effectiveness between years 3 and 5 of experience. And so if a lot of tenure decisions are being made in year 3, I wonder if we're making these decisions before teachers have really shown us everything that they can do, and if anybody's thought about pushing tenure decisions to maybe year 4 or 5 so that teachers have more of an opportunity to show their true merits.
So I think it's a good question. I think, just let me start by saying I think there's a little bit of debate still about when teachers sort of max out on teaching effectiveness, and I think depending on the models you use and the data you have, you get different answers to that. And just to be specific, I think while no one would suggest that it's much less than 4 or 5 years, I think there is some evidence that would suggest it could be longer. But the point of your question, I think, is a good one, that decisions, for example, in California that are made in the second year, or in New York that are made in the third year, may be too early to have enough evidence. And I think that's, to some extent, the impetus around the large percentage of teachers who got extended in New York. We just want more data to help us be sure that you are, in fact, going to be an effective teacher, because we're making a lifetime decision here.
And where they peak is a little different than whether their rank order changes. And so there's been work on surgeons, for example, that just says even though a surgeon will improve throughout their career, well into the middle of their career, they don't change rank. They're essentially going with their cohort in the same position each subsequent year. And so if that's true, you could actually make earlier decisions rather than later decisions, and kids would be better off. In the back. You're all in the back.
Duncan Chaplin, Mathematica. Thanks for the excellent presentations. And so I wanted to follow up on your last point about the teachers moving up in rank order. I would imagine that a lot of people, if they got a negative rating or if they were extended, they might put in more effort to improve themselves. And I'm wondering if there's any way of getting at that in your data, and if you could look at variation over time or anything.
Yeah, yes, exactly, Duncan. And so that is one of the things we want to better understand, and that's part of the reason that we're engaged in this sort of next series of studies. But part of it is just to get more years of administrative data to allow us to follow the teachers who've been extended to see how they change relative to people who didn't get that label. And so I think there's the potential for some more strongly causal kinds of information there.
And Jim, DC. You should mention your DC results.
Yes. So thanks for the opening, Dan. So Tom D and I have been doing some work in DC for the last few years, and as you know, DC has a very clear identification and bucketing of teachers into categories. If you're ineffective, you immediately get dismissed. But if you're minimally effective, you're told that if you don't get better within a year, you will be dismissed. And so those people are under a really strong incentive. Many of them leave, and so there's a regression discontinuity. We show that they disproportionately leave, but they also disproportionately improve in ways relative to the people who are just on the other side of that threshold and don't have the same incentive. And so these incentives do seem to make a difference, but I will say that they make a difference within a system that has made a lot of effort to support teachers and help them improve. They get coaching, they get other things. So it isn't just the label and said, you need to figure out how to get better, because I think one of the problems is teachers don't know. It isn't like teachers are saying, I could be better, but I don't want to put out the effort. I don't think that's what's going on. They're just not sure how to get better. And so I think the support that DISIC provides, at least that's our hypothesis, has been helpful.
Terrific. Do we have a last question?
Going up.
This is related to specifically a question for Cory, but in making things useful. Cory, you were pretty coy earlier about the reasons for this pension change. My assumption is it came about because of strong political pressure from teachers' unions. So is there any way within that sort of an environment that research of the type you've done can change policy either there or elsewhere?
Well, so I think with regard to the pension issue specifically, one thing that was really disheartening to me was look at the, and I'm blanking on the St. Louis, what I was for St. Louis, but for Missouri State there were also enhancements. And I actually found minutes from the legislative session or something where this was approved. And, it says things like, this change was, the presentation was made, it was debated on the floor for 3 minutes and 14 seconds and approved. And it's like $1 billion or something, right? And so my hope is that if the research base exists, it could actually, I feel like the legislators have no idea. The actuaries just say, okay, this will be fine. They say, okay. I mean, my hope is that the research, that people, when this is happening again in the future, people can look at the research and actually think about this more and have some evidence. I wish they would have thought about it more, but to be fair, there wasn't much evidence about what would happen, and there just hasn't been much study of it. So I do think there's room. There's a lot of, in the pension arena in particular, there's a lot of room for information. The challenges of disseminating are there, but there's a lot of information that can be brought to the table.
I have a related question, and what I wonder is if there is a connection to the way that people fight to protect their jobs if they're tenured and they are worried about losing them. There has to be a connection to that expected pension wealth. So I wonder, for lawmakers who are trying to make it easier, I'll talk about Washington, easier to dismiss teachers that are ineffective, it seems like the way that they get there, I wonder, is the way that they get there to move some of that compensation out of deferred and into the moment where they're capturing more of that wealth up front. So it seems like there's a real, I would say, obvious connection for lawmakers why they should care about that question.
Yeah, I very much agree with that. I will also say, I know we're all focused on, pushing teachers out and lose their pensions. The biggest issue is these systems were all put into place, 50 years ago when everyone sort of just stuck around. People move all over the place now, and all kinds of teachers lose their pensions for nothing related to how good they are. They change states, and their whole pension goes away, and there's no reason that should happen to them. And so there's all kinds of reasons why teachers lose their pensions. But certainly, as we move into this more rigorous evaluation, we want to have consequences for this. The pension system is certainly lurking there, and it's an issue.
Great. When I'm done thanking you, you're going to take a break, and we'll be back at about 5 after 11. But I wanted to thank you for your questions. They were terrific. It's been a great session. And to the panelists, great set of papers. Thank you.